Hello, you're listening to Storytelling Saga, the podcast that shares stories. I'm your host, Allie, and this week I'm sharing writing tips. And these are writing tips that I've garnered throughout the years, whether from school or more recently when I've taken writing workshops. So it's stuff I've learned throughout the years from that, and also just from my own research, so online and from various books. So we'll go ahead and start with an important rule that my TV instructor would say to us constantly, and that is that personal is universal, meaning that when you're coming up with an idea for a story, it's always a good idea to look at your own life and what interests you. And that's why when I end this podcast, I always say to write what you love. Same thing as they always say, write what you know. So whatever interests you, whatever you're passionate about, topics that you yourself know about, or obviously, of course, from your own life, and turning it into a work of fiction, whether it's a book or a show. And so there are many ways to go about writing a story. Everyone has their own process, obviously, but there are key things to do that can help you with that process. And so the basic thing to start out is to figure out, well, it's different for everyone, but I think one of the best ways to start is to look at character, who your main character is, and more specifically, what your character wants. That's very important because your main character is the person who is driving the action of the story. They're the ones making the decisions. They're the ones that have to go through the biggest conflict, the biggest change. And that's more relevant really in books and in movies. Because in TV shows, it's more about character relationships. And in TV shows, it's interesting because they don't necessarily change the characters. There is character development, of course, because you don't want to watch the same character be in the same place they were, say, in season 1 as opposed to season 10. But more specifically with a movie, there's a clear arc known as the hero's journey. And basically it's the character wants something, they have to figure out how to get it, there are obstacles along the way, and through it all, through the journey, by the end, they come out having changed, hopefully in a positive way. And so this is relevant to any type of story, because the central character has an emotional conflict, they drive the action, and it's their choices that make the plot progress, and they're the ones who resolve the problem. Those 3 things I just listed, that specifically I took from the TV Writer's Workbook by Ellen Sandler. I highly recommend it if you're interested in writing for television. And so with that, that's how you structure your story. So in that book, Ellen says, find stories that have something about them that is emotionally meaningful to you. So that is your original voice. And she says, transfer that passion to the established character in the world of his or her show form. So this is TV, but obviously you can apply it to anything. You can apply it to a book. And she says, you need to care and establish a connection with the story or else it will lack passion. So of course that ties back to writing what you care about. Writing about characters that you're going to want to follow and establish a connection with. And so with TV specifically, I'm going to be jumping around in terms of like the medium, so TV, movie, book, plays too actually, but really this is all relevant to any type of writing, so take from it what you will. But so what I learned in my TV course specifically, that a setup for any episode of television, it breaks down as these 3 elements. The predicament, which is the premise, complication, which is the rising action, and then the resolution. So if you have a good ending, you'll have an episode, you'll have a story to tell. And so with the predicament, it is what the story is about, what your main characters are trying to accomplish, or your main character, and why they want it. And it's also important to establish what's at stake. In TV and in movies too, really, it's all about raising the stakes. So, like, the more at stake, the more invested the character will be. Like, obviously, when it's a life or death situation, it has to be worth it to watch it. And then through that, if you're writing, whether it's a comedy, you could find humor in it, or if it's a drama, you can make it more emotional. And then part 2 of that is complication. That leads to eventually, like, an act break in TV. But in books and everything, it leads to, well, the rising action, eventually the climax. The complication is some kind of twist. So if something's going well for a character, eventually there has to be something to kind of stop them and make them have to make a decision. It can be some sort of twist that leads the character to a new path. And they don't necessarily have to come to a decision right then and there, but as you go towards the end of the story, they will eventually come to some sort of resolution. And to the resolution, that's when you wrap up the problem and all the issues, and you make sure that the journey was worth getting to, that the character earned whatever comes to them at the end of the story. And it can be a good ending or a sad ending. And so I want to reiterate that the driving force of the story is what the main character wants to accomplish. This was a big thing that I learned in a playwriting course I took back in college. What does the character want? In every single scene, the character has to want something. There has to be a purpose for why they're there. What do they want? What's their drive and their ambition, and why? And all of that plays into what's at stake for them and how it's personal to them, thus personal to you, the writer, and then it becomes personal and relatable to the audience. So all of this makes for compelling and engaging and interesting storytelling. And while I'm on the subject of playwriting, since I just brought that up, this is a good time to bring up a concept called Chekhov's gun. You may have heard of it. If you haven't, what it is, it's a dramatic principle that states that every element of the story has to have a purpose. It has to be necessary to the story. If it's not, it should be removed. And it comes from the analogy, it's from a playwright, Anton Chekhov. And basically, it's summed up in, if there's a gun in the first act, it needs to go off by the second act. So if you're describing anything in a scene, just anything at all, if it's not relevant to the story later on, not planting a seed of some sort, then take it out. It doesn't need to be there. You can have details in a story, specifically really in fiction, because fiction, you want to paint a picture with your words, obviously, because it's not a visual medium like television and movies. So when you're writing a book and you're describing things, it's good to have personal details to get descriptive. That's always a good thing. But if you're talking at length about something that's not going to be relevant overall for the story, then it's not important and it shouldn't be there. Because things like that just weigh down the story and just weigh down the narrative. And ultimately, in the end, won't be relevant to the story overall. And so one of the key things I learned in the TV and screenwriting courses that I've taken in recent years, that an outline is absolutely essential before you actually jump in and start writing your screenplay or your script. And the reason it's so important is because it is your roadmap to the story. And I was told by my instructors that you should know your ending before you actually start your story. It can change as you write it, but you should know where your story is heading towards and what kind of resolution you want to see. Again, if there is something as you're writing it and your character surprises you in some way, you decide to take a different route, that's totally fine. Because obviously, as you write, things change along the way. You go through multiple drafts. But the important thing to remember is that you need to write an outline before you go ahead and jump in and write your story. Because eventually, in my experience, when you just jump in and start writing the story, you'll hit a roadblock. And you won't know where the story should go next. And so if you have your outline, at least you have the roadmap. And even if it'll change after the first few rewrites, that's okay. But It's just good to start out. And with the outline basically for screenwriting specifically and for television writing, it's just describing what happens in each scene. So for television writing, it's broken down Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3, tying back again to our predicament, our complication, and our resolution. And so in the outline, you break down each scene with the slug line, which is, say, interior home day, and then what characters are in the scene, what they want, what the action is. So then once you have your outline, you can go ahead and write the first draft. And with any form of writing, it's important to remember that writing and editing are two separate things. I'm guilty of this as well, of, say, writing a line of dialogue, reading it back, and immediately rewriting it or tweaking a small thing. And it's important to kind of restrain yourself from doing that because, first of all, it's a good idea to, say, write a page or two or write 1,000 words or so and leave it alone and then come back to it with fresh eyes if you want to revise that scene. Because at that point, you had some time away from it, so you can kind of read it as not being so close to the material in a way. But this is why it's also good to get feedback from other people. The other really important thing to remember is that your first draft isn't going to be good. I've learned that, I've been told that so many times. It's okay if your first draft is bad. The important thing is to get it done and to not be so critical of yourself. I'm still learning that with my own writing, to not be so self-critical. And it's important to trust the process. So the key to writing is plainly and simply to get it done and to know that writing is rewriting, that there's no such thing as a perfect draft. Nothing has ever been done in just one draft. Not a single book, not a single play, not a single episode of television, not a single movie we've ever seen in our entire lives. Everything has gone through multiple revisions from many people. That's important to remember too. Particularly when it comes to television, it is an extremely collaborative medium, meaning that not one person writes the entire script. It goes through a writing process with an entire writer's room of people, say a dozen or so people, but obviously it varies. Everyone pitches in ideas, pitches in jokes, pitches in story beats. And so even when it comes to writing your memoir or a novel, you have an editor, you have a publisher, so people give their feedback as well. And all of that stuff helps improve your writing. It's always good to get feedback from others. I do that with my own scripts. I have a friend who I send scripts to, and she sends me her stuff, so we give each other notes. We give each other story ideas, joke ideas, and it's definitely helped improve my writing. And it's something, when you help others too, that improves your own writing as well. So getting feedback and giving feedback helps writing because you get to see what can be improved, what can be made better, how to make the story stronger. And the key really to effective storytelling, it really all drives back to character. Character is key. And through character, though, for the story, conflict is key. And so you get conflict with characters wanting different things, or something standing in the way of your main character getting what he or she wants. And the way to get interesting characters is really to write about people or animals, objects, anything that's interesting to you. Whether it's people that you knew in your life or enhanced versions of your personality, for example. Things, again, that are personal to you, that you can relate to, and thus the audience will relate to. And a cool writing exercise I learned from the TV writing course specifically is to plan out before you even start writing your script. Plan out how each character feels about all the other characters. So say you have 5 main characters. You make a map of how character A feels about B, how character B feels about A, how character B feels about C, how character C feels about B, etc. So how each character feels about the other one. And through that, you establish the relationships and what kind of conflict you're going to get and the kind of dynamic between each characters. You want the characters to have strong attitudes and opinions about things and opposing attitudes, because through that you have more conflict. All of this will in turn help advance the story. And so I want to talk a little bit specifically now about dialogue, because this ties back to character and how no two characters should sound alike. They should all have their own unique voice. And one of the important things I learned about dialogue is that dialogue should be treated as its own form of action. And so when you rely on dialogue too much to quote-unquote tell, that's when your story starts to sound expositional, like too much exposition. Obviously, it's important to establish the characters, to establish the world, which is true in whether it's a novel or in television, setting up the premise with the pilot in particular. And a key thing to remember about dialogue is that it's not necessarily real-life speech. In other words, in a movie, for instance, you don't have the characters just talking about mundane things. Whatever they're talking to pertains to the plot. It has to advance the story. The other thing about dialogue is that it is a tool to reveal information about your characters. In other words, what makes them unique, where they're from, their dialect, whatever they're hiding from other characters, or whatever they're trying to get from other characters. And the way to make dialogue effective is to essentially just talk about what's most important, to cut out all like the unnecessary speech and just fast forward to the interesting part. And so you use dialogue to display conflict rather than simply deliver information to the audience or the readers. And so through that, your dialogue will reveal things about the characters, move the plot forward, and not just provide backstory and thus become boring. And to that point, this relates to that classic rule of showing versus telling in writing. This is more specific to fiction writing when you're writing a novel, because in television writing it's different because it's more visual, same with writing a screenplay. But when it comes to writing a novel, the difference between showing versus telling is that telling, it's kind of like successive things of what the character's doing. For instance, she walked in, she saw this, she sat down. Like, it's important to avoid successive sentences beginning with the character for every single sentence, but that's another rule. With showing versus telling, telling would be the room was messy, but showing, it's more about engaging all the senses and delivering that information in a more compelling way. So instead of saying something like, she was hungry, it's more visually compelling and engages all the senses if you say something like, her stomach growled as she smelled the delicious aroma of blueberry pancakes wafting through the kitchen. So basically, with showing, it's engaging all the senses. And it's also not relying so heavily on the being verbs. I've learned this more recently, like through research. So not using words like, he is tall, instead saying, he nearly hit that, oh God, how would you even say that? He almost hit the ceiling. So you could like visualize how tall he is. And while I'm on the subject of avoiding being verbs, there was some article I read a while back that said the 8 words you should avoid while writing. And again, this pertains to writing fiction or writing a book, novel, etc. And these words are suddenly, then, in order to, very and really. The being verbs is am, are, was, or were. Started, that, and like. And all these words basically just are unnecessary and they kind of bog down the narrative. The other thing I have learned is to avoid relying so heavily on adverbs, like they walked swiftly or he said angrily, because when you do that, you're not trusting the lines, the dialogue when you use those kinds of descriptions. And it's also basically a shortcut, and in turn it's a way of telling rather than showing. That said, it doesn't mean you have to cut those words out completely. It just means to not rely on them and be more conscious of those words. I also learned to not use words when using dialogue in fiction, to not say like he screamed, she exclaimed, to instead just say like he or she said, and have the dialogue itself be the action, be another storytelling element that again reveals character and helps the characters get what they want. And the other important thing is that clarity is key when it comes to all forms of storytelling. For you, the writer, to know what the characters want in each scene and what's stopping them, whether it's an external force or some sort of internal conflict. For instance, some sort of fear or an emotional risk. And that, again, ties back to what's at stake for the character, and thus what's at stake in the story. Because if the character is emotionally invested, the audience will then be emotionally invested in what's happening and wanting to see the character succeed and to reach his or her goal. Because at the end of the day, what this all boils down to is the character's goal, their journey to get there, and the obstacles that stop them, and what they learn from the end of it. And it can be a small change or a big change, especially when it comes to movies, what they learn. Because that's who we're following. We're following the protagonist through this journey, and we, the audience, want to see them go through what they have to go through to get what they want. And if you're struggling with where the story should go next, what the character should do next, any form of writer's block, there are a lot of like random tips I've learned throughout the years. One is to kind of step away from the project, maybe move on to another one and come back to it after a day or two or even an hour or two, whatever works for you. One is to also take the character out of the scene, write a separate scene where you're convincing the character why they're in that scene, what they want out of it, or what you want them to get out of it. Another tip is to write all the possible things that wouldn't happen next. So kind of process of elimination in terms of, well, this wouldn't happen. And then through that, you'll learn, oh wait, maybe this could happen. I've also learned about the process of yes and, which is an improv process, meaning you just accept whatever you've written, say, and you just see where it goes. Because that's one of the amazing things about writing, when you're surprised along the way and your characters will take you somewhere that you didn't necessarily think they would go, but that's when your characters really come to life and take over the story, and you yourself as the writer step back and let the characters do what they want. Because that's how you make characters authentic and interesting, characters with flaws, characters who are trying to achieve something and thus grow as a result. So to recap, remember that personal is universal. You want to love your characters, relate to your characters. You want to know what the character wants, what they're going to get out of this journey, why you're telling this story. Remember that every scene needs to be essential. Every line of dialogue should either advance the plot or reveal something about the character. Remember to trust the writing process. Know that your first draft isn't going to be amazing, but that's okay. As you continue to rewrite, you'll find pieces along the way of things you love, and your characters can surprise you. And through all this storytelling, you learn about yourself and you connect with your audience. And with that, that's going to conclude this episode of Storytelling Saga. Be sure to follow the podcast on Facebook and on Instagram at Storytelling Saga, as well as on Twitter at StorytellSaga. You can also send me any questions, comments, or writing prompts by leaving a message in the contact section at storytellingsaga.com or by sending me an email at storytellingsaga@gmail.com. Next week, there are 3 things I've learned never to discuss with people: religion, politics, and the Great Pumpkin. I'm sorry to break your rules, Linus, but I will be discussing It's the Great Pumpkin, Charlie Brown. Until then, thank you for listening, and remember, write what you love.